Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Fanenga. I'm the Director of Programs here at the Santa Barbara Trust for Historic Preservation. I would like to thank all of you so much for coming tonight to the screening of Free Chol Soo Lee as a part of our Asian American film series that we do every year. Thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it and want to thank all of you for making this film series possible every year and for being so supportive of us. And I want to also thank Deborah Cristobal, who is a member of our Asian American Affinity Group, who is going to be leading this interview today with our special guests. Deborah has been with our Asian American Affinity Group for 12 years. She's a talented artist, fashion designer, actress, screener at our Santa Barbara Film Festival. She's just an all-around great person. And so thank you, Deborah, for leading this interview. We really appreciate you. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to you to do our introductions of our special guests.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Well, we are very excited today to have not only the filmmakers of Free Chol Soo Lee, but also the narrator. And I'm going to be reading their bios for you so you can get a little bit of information about them and see what their experience has been. So Sebastian Yoon is the narrator of Free Chol Soo Lee. And Sebastian, we'd like to hear your personal story and connection to the film here today. I'll be asking you about that. To begin this Q&A, I want to read a note that was written by you. Quote, in the US today, more than 50% of formerly incarcerated people return to prison within 3 years of their release. And ever since the inception of mass incarceration in this nation, recidivism rates have always remained high. To explain recidivism or the actions that lead or could lead to it, we often point to structural racism, to the lack of familial and societal support, or simply to the immorality of the culprit or the accused. Yet we seldom contemplate mental health, the trauma caused by incarceration, the hopelessness, the nightmares, the dehumanization, the tormenting tension between the desire for and fear of isolation. And I imagine all of this world would have particularly affected the guiltless, such as Chol Soo Lee, unquote. Sebastian, we look forward to hearing your story. Julie Ha, her storytelling career spans more than 2 decades in both ethnic and mainstream media, with a specialized focus on Asian American stories. She worked as an editor for 10 years at Koream Journal, a national Korean American magazine, and served as its editor-in-chief from 2011 to 2014, during which time she led award-winning coverage of the 20-year anniversary of the Los Angeles riots. She has written for the Hartford Courant in Connecticut, the Rafu Shimpo, a Los Angeles-based Japanese-American newspaper, and the Los Angeles Times. Her feature stories have earned her awards from the New American Media and the Society of Professional Journalists. In 2018, the Korea Economic Institute of America honored her for contributions to journalism. A graduate of UCLA, where she studied English American Studies and worked as a student editor, she is past board secretary of the Asian American Journalists Association, Los Angeles chapter, and a founding board member of the late 90s reboot of Gidra, a progressive Asian American magazine that originated in 1969. Free Chol Soo Lee marks her first documentary film project. Eugene Yi is a filmmaker, editor, and journalist. His film editing work has premiered at the Berlin International Film Festival, the Sundance Film Festival, the Tribeca Film Festival, and others. Selected titles include the news and documentary Emmy-nominated Farewell Ferris Wheel, a documentary about guest workers in the carnival industry, and Out of My Hand, a fiction documentary hybrid that was nominated for an Independent Spirit Award. and won the Grand Jury Prize at the 2015 Los Angeles Film Festival. His web video work has been in the New York Times, CNN, Frontline, The Washington Post, BuzzFeed News, Al Jazeera, and Deadspin. He served as assistant editor on Inside Job in 2010, which won the Academy Award for Best Documentary. He was named one of the 2017 National Media Maker Fellows with the Bay Area Video Coalition for Free Chol Soo Lee. He taught at the Edit Center, a school for film editing formerly based in Brooklyn. Yi's print journalism has been honored with numerous awards, including the LA Press Club Award for his oral history of the 1992 Los Angeles unrest from the Korean American perspective for Korean Journal. And he is a native of Los Angeles and a graduate of Brown University, where he studied neuroscience. Very fascinating. So let me get into the questions. I'm sure our audience is very excited to hear from you guys' perspective. So Julie and Eugene, what is your personal connection to Chol Soo Lee's story? Why did you decide to make this film?
Yeah, well, both Eugene and I have known about the Chol Soo Lee story actually for quite some time. We learned about it, each of us, through KW the journalist who's featured in our film, and he's an influential figure in both of our lives. For me personally, he's my mentor of 30 plus years. I met him when I was 18 years old, and he actually inspired me to want to become a journalist in the first place. But really the seeds of the story in terms of making a film about it weren't planted until 2014, when after Chol Soo Lee died. And I had attended the funeral to write an obituary for the magazine I was working for at the time, as well as to check on KW, who was in terrible anguish. He had never expected to outlive Chol Soo. And so I had attended the funeral and was really just struck by the emotion in the room. There was just like, I guess it felt like a feeling that was beyond grief. And I often describe it as a heaviness. And the people present at the funeral were the activists who had come to Chol Soo's aid decades earlier, as well as KW. And I was struck by what some of them were saying. One activist talked about how she would always regret not doing enough for Chol Soo. Another activist said, in the end, Chol Soo did more for them than they did for him. And I was really touched by that kind of depth of humanity, compassion, and responsibility they felt to another human being. And then at one point, KW stood up and he was clutching this Buddhist monk's walking stick that Chol Soo had carved for him. And he was very emotional, and he said, "Why is this story still underground after all these years?" And he was really lamenting how this was this landmark Asian American social justice movement, the first of its kind, and really such an unusual alliance that came together. You know, you had first generation Korean immigrant church-going grandmothers standing alongside third generation college age radical activists. That's just something you don't really see, you know, in our history, in American history. And yet this was not even a case that was taught in Asian American studies in our colleges and universities. And I think KW knew how consequential knowing this history could be. And so, you know, this heaviness from the funeral, it stayed with me. And so fast forward about 9-10 months later, and Eugene and I were talking about making a film together. Previously, we had worked together as journalists and had always enjoyed collaborating together, and really shared a passion for telling complex Asian American stories with nuance and depth. And so I told him, you know, somebody really needs to make a film about this story. And so we both just decided we would be the ones to do it. Yeah, it felt too important allow to stay buried in history. And I think we both felt like it was probably, this was our generational responsibility.
Right. Well, I'm so glad that you did. That's wonderful. And Sebastian, how did you get involved with this film? And did you know who Chol Soo Lee was prior to joining the film?
Yeah, to answer this question, I would have to speak about my past, which is that I have been incarcerated. I've been incarcerated from the ages between 16 and 29. I served 12 and a half years, during which I joined or entered a Bard Prison Initiative, which is a college program for incarcerated people. And there I received my bachelor's degree after writing a senior project on how Korean American have created their identity through the lens of Japanese colonialism. And it was during the senior paper, during the writing process and my research process, that I've came across Chol Soo Lee a few times, but his name, there wasn't much details about him. I just knew that he was someone who was involved with Asian American movements in the United States. But for the most part, you hear or you read about Vincent Chen, but not Chol Soo Lee. So I'm sorry, this kind of timeline is confusing. During my time as a college student in Bard Prison Initiative, I became involved with a documentary called College Behind Bars. And it's a 4-hour docuseries that shows the power and transformative power of education for incarcerated people. And I was doing a speaking engagement after release about the film, and Sue Kim, who is one of the producers of Free Chol Soo Lee, she was in attendance, and I guess she reached out to Julie and Eugene, and they had a conversation about me possibly joining the team to be the voice of Chol Soo Lee.
Wonderful. That's fantastic.
Actually, Deborah, if I could just add, because I think Sebastian's being very humble. Yeah, basically, I think when Sue saw Sebastian speak, there was something about him that obviously she said reminded her of Chol Soo Lee, and that he was just so honest and genuine. And she thought maybe he also had that kind of innate friendliness that KWII talks about Chol Soo in our film. And so, yeah, that's, she sort of, I think almost by instinct felt like he could voice Chol Soo Lee. And yeah, we feel very fortunate that he took a chance and said yes.
It's very effective because it's pretty seamless when you're watching the film, since we don't really know his voice that well, except when he comes like towards the end and everything. It feels real, like when I was watching it, I felt like it was very believable, and I didn't question it, because you have somebody who's roughly the same age range, and he reads with such emotion that you really, and he's had the similar experience. And so it makes sense that his voice would resonate with that pain and similar things that, Chol Soo had. So yeah, it was a beautiful choice. And you did a wonderful job with that. It really adds to the compelling, the voice and Chol Soo's story. It really adds a lot to it, having that voice to bring it to life. So great choice, you guys. And Julie and Eugene.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Cool for her to discover you. That was fantastic. And Julie and Eugene, where did you get the quotes from Chol Soo that Sebastian is speaking? It sounds like they could be from his letters, but who was he writing to, and how did you go about obtaining these letters?
It came from a couple of different places. The letters themselves came from the participants we had in the film, the people that we spoke to. I think says something that so much of the archive that we were able to pull from was actually retained and kept by the people who were involved or connected with the movement itself. I mean, they sort of not only recognized that moment as this crucial moment in Asian American history and just, American history, as we like to say, but, there was just this really personal connection to Chol Soo that just made it a really seminal moment in so many of their lives, the lives of the people who were involved. A lot of the writings also came from Chol Soo Lee himself, from his prison memoirs, which were published with the help of a scholar named Richard Kim. And we were only able to use a fraction of it, and they really sort of delve into not just Chol Soo's past, but his life in prison. And I just really want to, again, kind of shout out Sebastian for helping us really shave down what to focus on. Again, I think it was really through Sebastian's experience that we were able to find moments in the memoirs that really spoke to kind of some of the mental anguish and just the toll that being incarcerated takes on a person. I mean, without Sebastian's help focusing that, I think Julie and I would have had a much more difficult time kind of really homing in on what was most kind of central to his journey.
Absolutely. And it's true, because a lot of times documentaries, they're just interviews, but you don't really get that human connection that you get with your film because of having Sebastian helping you with that, bringing Chol Soo to life through his own words, and also sharing some of that experience. And speaking of that, Sebastian, what were your creative choices in how you voiced Chol Soo? Like, how did you channel his energy?
Thanks for the question. I just want to add a little note to what you said earlier about documentaries, right? Especially when they are related to incarceration or incarcerated people. Right. Documentaries tend to focus on violence that goes on in order to gain viewership. And one of the unique components of this film is that we don't focus only on the violence that happened, but we also want to focus on the trauma, dehumanization that occurs in prisons that lead to mental health decline. With that said, channeling Chol Soo Lee wasn't actually difficult for me. When I read his words, it kind of felt as though those were words that I have said to myself oftentimes. There's a particular scene where Chol Soo talks about waiting for the officer to hopefully stop by his cell to drop off a mail. And that's something I've experienced for 12 and a half years. It's a moment in prison when the entire cell hall gets quiet and all you hear is a single footstep, which is the officer carrying a batch of mail. And he stops after every few cells. And when he comes around you hear him, your heart kind of starts slowing down. And you're hoping that, the officer will stop in front of your cell and drop something off. And I was really emotionally connected to that scene. And I think you could hear it in the film as well. But yeah, I felt like I was there with him.
Wow. That's really touching. And just, that's a moment that we can relate to, as waiting for a piece of mail, but not in quite the same poignant manner that you're talking about, because most of us think of our mail as, it comes every day, and you kind of take it for granted. But to single that special time out is like, wow, it really brings attention to what all of us out here, and who are not in prison, just take for granted, our freedoms of getting the mail. So I appreciate that you bring that moment to light and how much you identified with that. That's really touching and very moving. And I'm sure will resonate with our audience very much. And
I remember the day we were, recording with Sebastian, and it was that recording that was so emotional and difficult, and we had to take a break because it's very hard for Sebastian. And we should acknowledge just that it was very difficult, I think, to work on this film in terms of possibly revisiting trauma, Sebastian experience. So that was, I think, really tremendously difficult. But I always remember something Sebastian told us, and he said he really wanted to work on this because he read Chol Soo's memoir, and he read the transcripts for all these interviews Chol Soo had done and really connected with him. But he also said because Chol Soo's no longer with us, he felt an obligation to stand up for him and to speak for him, and just wanted to make sure that after people saw this film, maybe they wouldn't be so quick to judge, Chol Soo for his stumbles after his release.
Right.
And could actually feel some empathy for the trauma he experienced and all that he had to overcome. So.
Absolutely.
And just a quick fun fact, Deborah.
Yes.
Before I started working on the project, I was practicing by myself, like how I would mimic Chol Soo's tone and voice and so on. And when we were about to record, I actually asked Eugene and Julie, is this something I should do? And they said, absolutely not. We want you to speak as your own voice.
Absolutely.
And at first I was a little confused, but looking back, I really appreciate that they didn't merge me as Chol Soo, like I'm my own individual. It's just that we have very similar experiences.
And that's great, because of course, nobody can duplicate somebody else. Everybody has their own story and what they're bringing to the project. And so, but the fact that your experience is very similar, and you could relate to those really, touching moments, and also the pain of what he must have gone through is just, it's so clear when we hear that in the film and watching it, because I know I was crying quite a few times, because it brings that rawness and that realness to the piece that, like I said, some other maybe more academic type or just interview type pieces don't show us. So, and on that subject, it was mentioned that Chol Soo had been abused by his mother for no reason. He had no explanation of why she was beating him, and that it also came out that he was a child of rape. And so it must have been so traumatic for him to be this child of all this, an unwanted child. And just, the mother must have expressed her anger against him, even though he was the innocent party, and how that must have also affected his life and the outcome of, his adulthood and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, the mother character was such an important piece for us, but it was actually a very difficult piece to incorporate into the story.
I'm sure.
We have a lot of plot, and also we had limited footage of her. And we knew we only had really, like, maybe we would have like 3 spots where we could put her in and try to flesh her out a little, and because she's such an important character in Chol Soo's life. We also, we didn't want to pass judgment though on her as well.
Right.
She was really a damaged person, and so we didn't think it would be fair for us to dehumanize her while humanizing Chol Soo. So we hope that audiences come away feeling some compassion and empathy for her as well, not to forgive what she did, but maybe just to have some kind of understanding. But yes, that was such a key part, we think, of Chol Soo's life and his struggle, was lacking that unconditional love of his mother. And you see actually the connection though between when the movement came in and sort of the disconnection he was feeling from his mother, you know, after the second prison charge, the second murder charge, after the prison yard killing. You know, Chol Soo says toward the end of the film, you know, he wrote a letter to his mother, you know, talking about the second murder charge. And she basically was cutting ties with him at that time. And that's around the time that, you know, KWLE writes his first letter that Chol Soo gets in prison, and, you know, says, I want to know your story and I want to help you. And so I think you see, in a way, Eugene and I discovered through the process of making this film was just that, you know, Chol Soo sort of had this surrogate family, you know, through some of the people in the movement, including KWLE and Ranko Yamada and some of the others who became quite close to him, especially those who stuck with him through his addiction and his struggles after his release.
Absolutely. Yeah. And also I wanted
to add,
of course, yes.
I just want to quickly, add that the humanizing of Chol Soo's mother really came late in the edit, and I just want to give credit to our editing team, Aldo Velasco and Jean Chan. It was Jean's addition towards the end of the edit that really helped sort of present her in a way that just felt right to us, I think, because Chol Soo's relationship with her was, of course, quite vexed, being sort of on the end of that relationship that he was. And, you know, I'm not an academic, but when sort of people talk about things like intergenerational trauma, it just sort of feels like this is kind of an expression of that to a certain extent, just what happens when you have all these legacies of war and imperialism and all these sort of big words. I mean, this is sort of how it expresses itself on a very human level. So I'm just sort of thrilled that our team was able to kind of come to that point where she was sort of shown in that way.
Yeah, because when I saw it, it didn't feel like, you know, it was just a big hammer to the head of the mother. It was, you know, she had also experienced a major trauma and had probably no other outlet or didn't understand, you know, how to get that out of her system and things like that. But then also, I think I can pretty safely say that most Asian children, they don't question their parents. You know, we're raised to obey, and that what your parents say is pretty much the law. And so he just had these negative things. You're worthless, you're no good, you're gonna grow up and not do anything good. So he didn't have any positive reinforcement as a child, but, you know, later had wonderful friends and people who advocated for him and things like that. But, you know, I think that must have been just a huge impact, having that come from a parent. But I thought the way that you guys had it at the more toward the end was really wonderful, because it gave us some insight into what he was dealing with, what he had dealt with as a child. Yeah. Okay. So this is open to anyone. Were there any surprises that you found when searching through the archival footage or documents?
I mean, there were so many surprises, but I think the most important surprise to talk about is just that footage itself. I mean, I mentioned it before, but it really did come from the community in really important ways. And people sort of kept it in their personal archives. And we came to call it our underground archive that we were able to draw from of Chol Soo Lee related material, because ultimately, you know, there is no archive unless there's an archivist and people deciding on an individual level to preserve that. And in many cases, it was Asian Americans who were involved in one way or another who sort of made that choice. And without them, we certainly wouldn't have a film today to share, let alone sort of this very visceral and immediate connection to those moments that the archival footage represents. I also just want to mention, you know, when you're making an archival film, you know, you're dealing with a lot of visual holes. And we did work with an extremely talented archival producer named Brian Becker, who was able to kind of unearth even more surprises related to the film that really helped us flesh out the language and the visual texture of the film, and the audio texture as well, because one of the wonderful surprises was that commercial for WWII that we sort of use as a way to introduce audiences to KW's character. And it was just such a powerful way to meet him, because you hear this commercial of a mainstream conservative newspaper using a Korean immigrant investigative reporter as their hook to try and sell subscriptions, as kind of their Woodward, their Bernstein, their star reporter. And it's hard enough to imagine, but I think that's the wonderful thing about archive. You don't have to imagine it. You can hear it and know that it happened, and that it was true. And so we're really fortunate to have worked with him and for the community to have sort of retained what they did.
Oh, that's so interesting. And again, for anybody, how did you manage to stay afloat while you were making the film? The injustice, the frustrations, the sadness, and how did you cope in your own lives while immersing yourself into Chol Soo's story?
That's a hard one. Who wants to go first?
I can just quickly mention, I think, I think for all of us on some level, Julie and I over the years, and I think, and I don't want to speak for you too much, Sebastian, but I mean, you have met some of these folks. I think being able to connect to the people who are involved with the movement, over the years, having worked on this film, I mean, we've grown quite close to some of them. And, one of the things that we talk about sometimes is sort of the lack of opportunities for Asian Americans to kind of have these intergenerational connections, either because of language and cultural barriers or because we just don't know our history and we don't know how to connect to what's happened in our communities. And so to be able to spend time with KW and Ronko Yamada and their families and so many of the people who agreed to sit down with us and spend time with us and share their archives with us was really just tremendously nourishing, I think, in a lot of ways for us, and kind of allowed, you have your film family, but like it's sort of to be able to have that kind of rapport and connection, I think is rare, and I think was really quite special.
That's fantastic.
Just to add another note, Deborah.
Sure,
this film was being developed during the time when the violence against AAPIs were, widespread. It was on the media, especially after the March shootings in Atlanta, and we saw, I think for the first time in my life, Asian Americans speaking up on a national level, right, throughout the country, getting together and fighting for anti-discrimination policies, coming together as a community. And there was a lot of semblance between that and the movement for Free Chol Soo Lee. And I think that as we move forward in society, more and more AAPIs will learn to harness this kind of energy. That's why I think this film has relevance even today. It shows that this is not the first time that AAPIs have gotten together to effectuate change. It's been done in the past, and we have been effective, and that we as a community have power if we bring ourselves together and speak as one voice.
Yeah. That's a great point. And I know for myself, seeing all the injustice done, to him, and it just really made me so mad. I just felt so angry, even though this was in the past, you still felt for him as if he was here right now. And then, of course, seeing everybody gathering around and fighting for him and making appearances. And it was just wonderful to see, and made me feel very proud to be an Asian American, to see our community just gather together, no matter what type of Asian American you were, or, early generation people who came over from the other originating countries. And it just like you said, it's just a very powerful thing, and it's good for people nowadays, in case they didn't know, to see that, you know, people coming to Asian people coming together of all different kinds. So that was very powerful.
And I think it bears just sort of underscoring that that kind of coming together was really not expected or common back then. I mean, the term Asian American, I mean, it just barely been invented in 1968, not that long before this. So this was kind of an early test case for whether that kind of connection and uniting that you're talking about could really happen. And I think it's why it's such an important moment for our history, because they showed that it's possible, and they came together, and they kind of were part of inventing the very idea of an Asian America.
Yeah, which is pretty incredible, because I remember, you know, living in a small town, Morro Bay, there was like only a teeny less than a handful of families that were Asian American. And so to see like a whole big grouping, and of course I know there's more Asian Americans up in the Bay Area, but it's just really cool to see a whole community come together when you've, you know, even in my generation, seen so few at a time. It's just very powerful to see everyone gathered together, and also that they did do it back in a day before this was even heard of, you know, for people to get together like that.
Yeah, so, and I think
cool.
It's really important to point out that they didn't rally around somebody who was a model minority, you know.
Exactly.
This was a poor Korean immigrant street kid who had a criminal record at the time. As he says himself, he was no angel. And the rest of society was actually treating him like he was disposable. And here was a group of people who looked at him and said, no, you know, you're worthy of our time, our attention, our love and care. And I think that's the message that we have to also really remember today, you know, that that he wasn't this perfect person, you know, when they decided to take up this cause. And I think that kind of depth of compassion and humanity is something we really need to, I think, heed today.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And also, you know, at the time, I don't believe there were any sort of rehab type programs to help people coming out of prison to socially adjust to civilian life afterwards. So he didn't really have a lot of coping mechanisms to, you know, from being in there for such a long time to come out. It must have been sort of a shock as far as, you know, thinking of this kind of adds to this other question, thinking about how the many injustices that there are in the US prison system and how many innocent people there are in there. What about Chol Soo resonated with the community, and why did his story take off in activism, do you guys believe?
Oh, go ahead, Julie.
Okay, and just jump in. Yeah, well, you know, as Jeff Adachi, one of the activists in our film who ended up becoming the elected public defender for San Francisco, said to us, it really was the perfect storm in a way. You know, this was a period of time that was post-civil rights movement, and also people were rallying in the anti-war movement as well. And there were young Asian Americans who were looking for positive, you know, and they were studying ethnic studies, and they considered themselves activists, and along came this cause. And so they embraced it wholeheartedly, because I think it spoke to something inside them, that kind of racism that they saw around them. And here was such an overt and horrible expression of it. And they wanted to be able to respond and do something and right this wrong. I think also there was, you know, K.W. Lee, the way he wrote his first series of stories about Chol Soo Lee really humanized Chol Soo as a person, as someone they could relate to. Not only these young activists, but also older people, including more conservative Korean Americans who learned about Chol Soo's, very difficult childhood, even, being separated from his biological mom, who was banished from her family for getting pregnant out of wedlock, and then finding mother and father and his aunt and uncle, but then being severed from that family when he immigrated to America to reunite with his mom, and then just really very quickly feeling abandoned by everyone and isolated and alone. And so KW was able to capture that kind of story in Chol Soo, and not only talk about the injustice and the racial bias in the investigation and conviction of Chol Soo Lee in our criminal justice system, but also just Chol Soo Lee, the human being, the bewildered boy who came to this country and was treated so inhospitably, and then just being railroaded in our criminal justice system. And so I think, KW was part of that, as well as I think Chol Soo Lee himself. I think he was, he had a really special quality about him, as anyone, who met him would talk about. And so I think also he, helped inspire all these supporters, and these activists to want to work as hard as they could, to do the impossible,
right.
to return to murder convictions and the American criminal justice system. That is quite impossible, but they worked so hard to do that, because I think the person inspired him. It inspired them. One activist, Gail Wong, who's in our film, she said that he wrote back to every person who wrote him a letter,
Oh my gosh.
and we know, like from Chol Soo's letters, he would stay up all night, writing these letters back to every supporter. And so I think there's a very special quality about Chol Soo himself, that I think, really deserves also credit for why this movement took off.
Oh, that's so cool to find out. I mean, he sounds like an amazing person, and his charisma definitely shows in all the scenes that you have with him. He's, he could have probably been a film star or something like that if he would have had a different life. Very handsome, charismatic, and people just liked him. And not everybody is likable, but somehow people just took him to their hearts, him, the person, no matter, regardless of what he had been through, but just he himself had that strong it quality, I guess, that people just were attracted to, which is really fascinating. And so what do you think the pressure was like on Chol Soo to be a star citizen after the release of his release? And what were your creative choices to show that continuation of his life in your film?
I mean, I think we always knew it was just really important to include that portion of his life. I mean, we're indebted to a television journalist named Sandra Jin, who was a TV reporter at the time, who made the first documentary about Chol Soo Lee. In 1983, it was a television news magazine piece about the movement, but it ended with his release and kind of on this happy note. And she continued to film with him after his release and over the years and after the arson as well. And so there's a lot that happened after his life that really kind of needed to be considered, we felt, to be able to tell the full story. And part of this sort of, I'll just add briefly, connects perhaps to why this movement was not as well remembered. I mean, Chol Soo himself spoke about this at times. speaking about how movements like the Vincent Chin movement, which Sebastian mentioned earlier, the story is a little bit cleaner perhaps than Chol Soo's. But it sort of goes back to what Julie was saying before. I mean, he was not a perfect person, but, does one have to be perfect to deserve justice? And so many people decided, no, they would fight for him, as Julie was talking about. And it sort of is an extension of that. Does he have to have been perfect for this movement, this incredible moment in our history to be remembered? And we hope that sort of by telling his full story, people can connect with him, see his resilience, judge him by his fight, and not just by his flaws and his mistakes, and just see that you can connect with him as an individual, see his resilience, and celebrate this moment of resistance that we hope people will sort of take into their hearts. That's at the center of the film.
Absolutely. And also there's I mean, at the end of the film, you guys were you showed that he had the opportunity to get help with surgery. Surgery was offered to him as far as fixing his face or fixing his injuries, and he refused them all. He just didn't want to do anything. Why do you think that was?
Well, it was actually, he was offered an experimental surgery where they would actually take a face from a cadaver and use on his face. So that's what he refused.
Oh, I see. Oh.
Well, as he says in the film, this is my face. This is what I'm gonna live and die with it. And I think it. I think we took it as also an embrace of himself, warts and all, and owning everything of his own identity and his journey, and making that kind of just making that kind of decision for himself that he had, my gosh, spent so much time trying to live up to being the symbol for a community that he felt like he owed his life to. And, I think after that arson, he spent a lot of time in isolation and witness protection, thinking about his life and reflecting. And I think he came to a place where, he, no more masks and no more trying to be something that he's not, and coming to peace with who he was and what he wanted to do with the rest of his life,
right. Okay.
And I think, that peace involved trying to spend the rest of his life calling attention to the movement that he inspired, and recognizing that although he felt quite burdened by this movement, he also realized that kind of depth of compassion and humanity that was shown to him is something that needs to be emulated. And it's something that needs to be extended today and in the future. And he saw that, and he saw that there could be power in that, and that was something good he could do, with the remainder of his life. And we see that's what he was trying to do, and we hope we actually picked up that mission that he seemed to have with our film, and we tried our best to try to continue that legacy.
Yeah, well, with his speaking engagements and things like that, that was really wonderful that he sort of, at the end, did want to do good and, continue on the good that was given to him, and the trying to spread that whole thing through what his movement had started, which is pretty powerful. And what would you say was the biggest challenge that you had in making this film?
Well, I think there were so many.
How long do you have?
We'll try to focus on a few. I think, okay, one thing was, I think Eugene and I always felt this tremendous responsibility to especially the Asian American community about this film and what this movement stood for and what it meant to the whole community of people. But I think that actually also, I think we had to liberate ourselves from that actually, and realize that we needed to tell the story that we wanted to tell. And not think about like, the importance to history and to, bring in all these experts to talk about and interpret its importance. We decided not to go in that direction at all, but just free the story of Chol Soo Lee, and allow his voice to ring out and allow him to tell his story. And that became our North Star. And so I think once we did that, I felt like things started to fall into place. I think the second thing was we never got a chance to interview Chol Soo Lee ourselves, since the idea for this story was born after he had died. And as much as Eugene and I tried to immerse ourselves in everything he left behind, we always felt like we were not getting close enough. And I think once Sebastian joined our project, and we collaborated on the script together for What Chol Soo Says, it felt like that's when everything also fell into place. And as he said himself, I think the original script that he read, like he thought there was too much of an emphasis just on the physical violence of prison, but what about that internal struggle? And so we created new scenes based on Sebastian's input, and he helped write them. And I think, that really helped flesh out that internal struggle, as Sebastian himself said, the dehumanization and the depression and the loneliness that Chol Soo was confronting. And so, I have to say, like, I don't know if Eugene felt the same way, but I often felt like I didn't know if I could ever feel at peace with the finished film that we made, because it felt like maybe we could never do this epic story justice. And I have to say, though, after, Sebastian joined our project and voiced Chol Soo Lee, after we saw the finished version of our film, I felt completely at peace. And I used to like try to talk to Chol Soo, and just say like, what do you want people to know about you? What do you want us to say in this film? And sometimes I feel like the answers came in the other people who put their fingerprints on this film, including Sebastian and our producers, Eugene Chen and Sona Jo, our composer, Gretchen Jude, and as Eugene mentioned, our archival producer, Brian Becker, and editor, Aldo Velasco. It's just like all these different individuals who came together, and that's, maybe that's how Chol Soo answered that, about what he would want people to know about him and his life. And I think, we're just tremendously proud, I think, of the film that we were able to create together.
Well, were you going to say something, Eugene?
No, just was going to agree with all of those.
It's a masterful film, and it's very touching. It doesn't have that sort of remote feeling that I was saying that some documentaries have, and your team is just extraordinary as far as everybody's what they have added and brought to your film. And Sebastian, how can we continue to honor Chol Soo Lee's legacy?
I would encourage folks, when we think about Chol Soo Lee and the movement to get him free, to not delimit it to trying to free an innocent man. That that was not the only goal, right? I think when the community came together to free Chol Soo Lee, they saw in him and the situation the injustices that everyone has experienced, meaning the supporters in the United States, the feeling of being the other, and seeing the injustices play out in the criminal justice system, and how that kind of is dispersed throughout their lives, and that they could feel Chol Soo Lee. It wasn't the fact that he was only Korean American. I think it was the idea of injustice in general that really served as the main core to bring people together. And let's not delimit the idea of innocence when we talk about mass incarceration, meaning let's not only try to help people who are innocent, who are incarcerated. As someone who was not innocent and who was in prison, you know, when we say something like when someone does a crime, they should do the time, right? We as a society should reflect on what that means when we say things like that. When we want to be simply vindictive and punitive, and we don't think about the ramifications of mass incarceration. We talked about the generational trauma that is passed down from mother to son, from Chol Soo Lee's mother to himself, and how generational trauma is all over mass incarceration in this country. When we incarcerate someone, their families are affected. And when they are released, they don't have any support. They come home with a felony. It's hard to find a job, and which is a main reason for why people go back to prisons. The socioeconomic conditions in which people are living, being marginalized communities, or being a person of color in this country. It is a difficulty that many people, like the supporters who came together for Chol Soo Lee, is something understandable even to us today. And I hope that Chol Soo Lee could serve as a symbol, that the movement to free Chol Soo Lee could serve as a symbol, a continuation that we as a community could come together to fight injustice.
Wow. Yeah, that's beautifully said, Sebastian. I really appreciate that. And is there anything that you guys would like to talk about that we didn't include or talk about at this time?
You were an amazing moderator. I just want to say thank you.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. Thank you, Sebastian. That's so sweet. I enjoy, as you can tell, I love this kind of work, and it's one of my favorite things about being on the committee is to get to meet filmmakers while I'm out at film festivals, as I met Julie and Eugene up at their Santa Barbara premiere. And I love meeting new people and talking to creatives, filmmakers and actors. And I would think you have a future as an actor if you ever wanted to go for that, because you have a great look and you feel, which is one of the main things that you have to do as an actor. If you ever wanted to go out for that, I think you should. That's just
we'll leave that to Eugene. He's much better looking than I.
The reason I like to stay behind the camera.
I know. I had an agent who was Korean, and he was super handsome, but I said, "Don't you want to be an actor?" And he said, "Oh, heck no." He liked being also behind the scenes with all the papers and, shuffling people around and stuff. So it's kind of funny. It cracks me up, because you always think, oh, when somebody's good looking, they should be in front of the camera. But it's not always that they want to do that, I just find that very interesting. But
could I actually just plug our film?
Oh yeah,
yeah. Okay, were you going to do that too?
Yeah.
So for people who want to watch it again,
yes,
tell your friends to watch it. It's currently streaming on Mubi.com. That's MUBI.com, and then also it's going to be on PBS's Independent Lens on April 24th in 2023.
Oh, fantastic!
Very excited about that. Yeah.
Oh, I'm so glad. I love when they're on PBS too. That's fantastic.
Yeah, and we'll also be doing a theatrical release in Korea. I don't have a date yet.
Oh,
so
great.
Our friends in Korea.
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, let me know when that happens so I can. Will it show here theatrically too again, or?
There are no plans for that right now.
Okay.
Right, Julie. We had our theatrical
this year.
We
know it. Yeah, we had our theatrical release in August. So
in August, and yeah.
Okay.
So.
Okay. Well, this has been fantastic. It was so much fun. This is the next best thing to seeing you guys in person. And I hope at some point in the future, that we will get to meet in person, because LA is so close. I don't know where you are, Sebastian.
New York.
Oh, okay. Well, I end up being back east sometime. But yeah, this was fantastic. Thank you all so much for being with us today. I know this was a big treat for our audience. So thank you.
Please go watch the film, everyone.
Yes, watch the film. It's fantastic. It's powerful. It'll probably make you cry. And you guys have done a fantastic job with it. And I was honored to be part of your Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
All right. We'll see you.
Bye.
Bye.